All right. All right, can you see my screen right now? It says AP Macroeconomics.
Yep, I can see it.
All right. So I'm going to stay on this screen because I also opened up just a blank Google Doc for those practice FRQs. I'm just going to show my work on this Google Doc. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between these slides and the Google Doc. So here we go. All right. So remember the exam is going to be only 5 units. They scaled it back from 6 units. They took off the unit regarding foreign exchange and trade. So it will cover the first 5 units of the course. There will be no graphing required. However, there is going to be more of an explanation on emphasis on explanation. There's going to be more of an emphasis on explanation. And a lot of times graphs can lead you to the answers that require explanation. So you're going to see questions I throw in here regarding graphs. I'm still going to use graphs and talk about how you can use the graph to conquer the FRQ this year. I threw this in there. If you're interested, it's a podcast I listened to a couple days ago from the Wall Street Journal. It's about 20 minutes long. And it talks about how the U.S. government I think they spent like $3 trillion alone. They spent $3 trillion just in the last quarter. And they borrowed all of that. That wasn't money that they had in their accounts. So the U.S. government just in the last quarter borrowed $3 trillion. And the podcast talks about, is the growing U.S. debt a concern? They talk about the argument between should we just continue to borrow and spend and not worry about budget deficits, or over time budget deficits going to come back and bite us? And they talk about a lot of the concepts that we discussed in class. They spend a lot of time on the concept of crowding out, and which is cool. When I heard crowding out mentioned in the podcast, like my eyes lit up. I was like, oh man, that's pretty cool. That something we discussed in class is something that economists worldwide talk about. And there's growing economists that are challenging the concept of crowding out and saying crowding out happens, but maybe we don't need to be as concerned about it as we once were. So it's a good podcast if you're looking for something short that connects to class, dives deeper into some of these philosophical discussions on debts and borrowing. The link's right there. All right, Unit 1. So with each unit, what I did is I started off each unit with just talking about some of the basic terms and concepts you should know. Then I threw in graphs and any important equations. So if you remember, Unit 1 talks about really 2 important things. It talks about opportunity cost and production possibility curves. And remember, opportunity cost is what you're giving, what you're sacrificing. So if you're watching this video right now, some of the things you could be sacrificing could be time spent with family or friends. It could be video games. It could be working out, think going to work, things like that. All right. Opportunity cost plays a big role regarding trade, international trade. It helps countries determine specialization, what they're best at. So countries are going to specialize in the things in which they have the lowest opportunity cost. And so try and quantify that in very simple terms. AP Macroeconomics focuses on 2 types of questions: input questions and output questions. An input question has to do with what is required to produce something. So an input question could look like, it takes Sarah 4 hours to knit a quilt. It takes John 2 hours to knit a quilt. Or it takes Nathan 30 minutes to bake cookies, and it could take Sarah an hour to bake cookies. And so using numbers like that, you would have to figure out who has the lowest opportunity cost and what people should specialize in. With the output method, it's looking at what people are capable of producing. So, for example, like the United States can produce, I'm in my garage right now, so the United States can produce 10 propane torches, while Japan can produce 50 propane torches. The United States can also produce in that time 30 hammers, while Japan can produce 20 hammers. So using information like that, you can determine in two things: absolute advantage and comparative advantage. And so we'll come back to this in a second and talk about some practice FRQs and how to use either the input method or the output method to determine opportunity cost and patterns of specialization. So that's the big topic number one for Unit 1, opportunity cost and comparative advantage. Another one is production possibility curves. So I just copied and pasted PPF or PPC, whatever you want to call it, from the web, and I put it right in here. Remember, PPFs show what an economy is capable of producing, and it's a very simplistic representation because it's only looking at two things. You know, like the United States is capable of producing far more goods and services. But to keep it simple here, they focus on two things. So in this case, this country can produce either wine or cotton, and it shows some production points on the graph. Production point X on the graph, economy that's being considered inefficient. So given their factors of production like land, labor, and capital, this economy is only producing at point X when really it's capable of producing at point A, B, or C. So that means that the economy is mismanaging its capital, its human or physical capital, or it's not using its land efficiently, or mismanaging its use of labor. If you're operating along point A, B, or C, that's efficiency. That's showing that given your factors of production, you're being efficient. You're maximizing your land, your labor, and your human and physical capital. Now, you can produce at different points along this PPF, meaning like if you're producing at point B and wanted to produce at point A, well, that means you're going to produce more wine. If you look at it, wine is on the y-axis here. By moving from point B to point A, you're producing more wine, but what's the trade-off? What's your opportunity cost? Well, your opportunity cost is that you're producing less cotton. You're giving up cotton to more wine. If you wanted to move from point B to point C, now you're making more cotton, but you're producing less wine. So the PPF serves a couple of important purposes. It can show what an economy is capable of, and it also demonstrate trade-offs, opportunity cost, what an economy gives up when they decide to produce more of one thing. They're giving up less of the other. The other thing I want to add here is you'll notice there's a red dot outside of the frontier. Here's this downward sloping curve that point A, B, and C are on. Point Y right here represents an economy, a point on the PPF that's not possible for this economy. They cannot get to point Y yet because they don't have the land, labor, and resources to get to point Y. So how do you get there? Well, you have people. That could be an increase in your labor force. You could increase your land size. If this was agricultural, you're increasing the amount of arable land that you have. Some of the more common one is capital. So if you have more technology, people become more skilled. There's more investment in automated equipment or training for employees. Now your I'm moving this around. Now your PPF is going to shift from one of these points out to point Y. Okay, so keep in mind that this frontier right here, this is like what your economy is capable of, and it's your measuring stick. This should look very similar. Let me see if I have. It should look very similar, or should be connected to long-run aggregate supply. Remember, long-run aggregate supply and this PPF right here, that's what the measuring stick for your economy. It's what your economy is capable of. So if you're operating along this point, that's good. You're meeting your goal. To get out here to move that long-run aggregate supply curve to the right would require an increase in one of the following: land, labor, or human or physical capital. Okay. Those are the two main concepts for Unit 1. The other concepts we talked about are supply and demand. I feel like we're going to touch on quite a bit in the third unit, and you guys should have a very good understanding of basic supply and demand charts. If you want more of an explanation on any of that, put in a review video from ACDC Econ. Also, a review of supply and demand from the College Board. So this video is published by and created by a couple of other AP macroeconomics teachers from throughout the country who have been graders and are, the big wigs when it comes to AP macro and the College Board. So you're welcome to check either of those two videos out. And now, knowing that, after the videos for each unit, I throw in some FRQ questions. Let's dive into them. All right, so if you look at part A, I'm just going to read this, and then I'm going to talk about how to answer each question. It says a country's at full employment and produces two types of goods, consumer goods and capital goods. Is this inside, outside, or on the production possibility curve? So right here, the key, you got to be able to dissect a question like this and pull out important words that will lead you to the answer. So the key here, and I underlined it, is full employment. So because your economy is at full employment, that means you're right on that PPF. That means you're right in long-run equilibrium. And so if you look back at this, that means that in that scenario, the economy is somewhere along this frontier, point A, B, or C. So because of that, you are on the production possibility curve. That would be your answer for part A. That's all it takes. You don't have to explain it. The only time, guys, you need to explain it if it says explain. If it doesn't say explain, just answer the question. And this is a great example of how, even though the exam is an FRQ, they're going to have actually like some multiple choice questions. If you look at the second sentence here, that's a multiple choice question. You got three options to choose from. You got a third of a shot. You got a 33% shot. Pick one. And because it says full employment, you're on the production possibility curve. Okay? Nathan, if you have questions too, just interrupt me whenever you want to.
Yep, I will.
Part B. Part B says interest rates decline in the economy in Part A. Would the opportunity cost of producing capital goods increase, decrease, or remain the same? So again, you got to be able to dissect questions like this. And to me, an important sentence right there is interest rates. And what's happening to interest rates? They're going down. Interest rates are declining. And so this expands and connects with topics that are discussed in Unit 5. When interest rates are lower, easier to borrow money. And so if you're a business, the time to invest in your business, whether it's hiring employees or training them or buying new equipment, buying more land, the time to do that is when interest rates are low. So because interest rates are lower, the opportunity cost of producing capital goods is lower. Because now what's going to happen is people are going to invest more in capital projects, things related to technology, education, talent accumulation. And so the opportunity cost of producing those things decreases. It's cheaper. And you can just form an argument or because you have to explain here, you have to form a 1 to 2 sentence explanation about why the opportunity decrease. And again, it's connected to interest rates. It's easier to borrow money. It's cheaper. So the opportunity cost is cheaper. Part C. Now, assume that one of the following occurs. Either your workers become more productive or you have more physical capital. That's what that second part means. The stock of physical capital means you have more of it. So what that means is you have more computers, you have more automated equipment, just anything that makes think of anything in a warehouse, from forklifts to skid loaders to containers, any of those things. Explain the effect this has on the production possibility curve. Okay, so because physical capital is a big component of long-run growth, Same with worker productivity. Anytime workers become more productive or you have more capital, that's a factor of production, your production possibility curve right here is now capable of shifting outward to point Y. Now capable of moving to point Y. So if you wanted to reverse this and say that capital decreases, you have less computers, you have less software, your labor force decreases, you're hit by a famine or an environmental dilemma, your production possibility curve would shift to the left because now you have less factors of production. You have less land, labor, and capital. Okay? All right, last one for this part. Now here is a connection back to opportunity cost and specialization and comparative advantage. All right, you got two countries, country X and country Y. It shows that country X takes an hour to produce consumer goods and 2 hours to produce capital goods. Country Y takes 2 hours to produce consumer goods and 4 hours to produce capital goods. And then the question is, which country has comparative advantage? And underline it. Underline the key words you got to find. You got to be able to explain it. So you got to find the comparative advantage in consumer goods and then explain it. So to do that, what I tell you guys to do is to make a table. So this is country X. Country X can make 1 unit of consumer goods or 2 units of capital goods. Country Y can make 2 units of consumer goods or 4 units of capital goods. And I'm just going to label this. This is consumer. Move these over. This is capital goods. Okay. So by looking at this, and it says this is the hours it takes. So I'm just going to put that right there. It takes 1 hour for each of these. It takes 1 hour, 2 hours, 2 hours, 4 hours. So because time is an input, this is an example of an input question. An input question. So you go back to your notes. All right, how do I find the input question? Go back to your notes. Input method shows the inputs used to produce. So the item in question becomes the numerator. So if you wanted to find what the opportunity cost was, country X of consumer goods, 1 divided by 2 is 1/2. Here, 2 divided by 1, 2. For here, again, this becomes the numerator. The item in question, this bad boy right here becomes the numerator. So 2 over 4 is 1/2. I'll move these over a little bit. Over here, this is the item in question. So this becomes the numerator. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay? This is your opportunity cost. I'm going to underline these. Shoot, hang on a second. Okay. All right, so the underlined numbers are your opportunity costs. And so now you look at 2 categories, consumer goods and capital goods, and you compare them. Who has the lower opportunity cost? All right, you're not going across. So what this means is if country X decided just to produce consumer goods, that means for every consumer good that they produce, it would take them a ½ hour to produce capital goods. For country Y, if they decided to produce consumer goods, it would take them a ½ hour to produce a unit of capital goods. That's what these numbers mean. It's your opportunity cost. And so what you would do here is you would compare them. Compare category of consumer goods and compare the category of capital goods. And you would circle, or in this case, I would bold it, a smaller number. You're looking for the number that's lower. That indicates comparative advantage. But in comparing these, a ½ and a ½, 2 and 2, nobody has the comparative advantage. The opportunity cost is the same. And so this is kind of a trick question that the AP will throw in here. Neither country has a comparative advantage in the production of consumer goods. And how you would explain that? You would just say in 1 to 2 sentences, because it takes each country a half an hour to produce capital goods. Neither country, therefore, has a comparative advantage. That's how you would answer something like that. Let's try another one. All right, this one, you have country A and B. They're producing hammocks and looms. Don't ask me what a loom is. I don't know. I know what a hammock is, but I don't know what a loom is. Hammock.
A loom is something for weaving.
Is it?
Yeah.
I figured it's something for like weaving or quilting or sewing, something like that. Country A can make 60 hammocks or 40 looms, while country B can make 40 hammocks or 20 looms. And in this case, it's broken into 3 questions, and you gotta find the opportunity cost and comparative advantage. So let's break this down. Give me a second. I gotta revise all this. All right, so we got hammocks. Over here, we got looms. Country A, country B. Country A can make 60. B can make 40. Country A can make 40 looms. 20 looms. Okay. This is showing what these 2 countries are capable of producing. So because of that, this is a output question. This is an output question. Anytime it's showing production. And so with an output question, if you're trying to find the opportunity cost of hammocks, the item in question becomes the denominator. I'll take you through the math here. You would divide 40 by 60. Here you would divide 60 by 40. Here you would divide 20 by 40. Over here, you would divide 40 by 20. All right, so I'm just going to work backwards here. So your opportunity cost here is 2. 40 divided by 20 is 2. Over here would be 1/2. 40 divided by 60 is 2/3. And over here, 60 divided by 40 is 1 2/3.
No, 3/2.
My bad. 1 1/2. Yeah, there we go. So now, after doing the math, this is showing your opportunity cost, meaning that if country A decided to produce hammocks, in the time it took them to make 1 hammock, they could be making 2/3 of a loom. If they decided to produce looms, for every loom they make, they're giving up 1.5 hammocks. That's what these numbers mean. So you go to 2 categories, and you pick the item or the opportunity cost that's lower. Here, 1/2 is less than 2/3. Here, 1.5 is less than 2. So country A has the comparative advantage in producing looms, and country B has the comparative advantage in producing hammocks. So if you wanted to look at if a question followed up and asked, all right, what's the pattern of specialization? You would say that country B would produce hammocks and country A would produce looms. So let's go back and look at some of the questions here. Question A says, what's the opportunity cost to produce a loom in terms of hammocks for country A? All right, so you go and look, country A, it would take them 1.5 hammocks to produce a loom. So that would be your answer. Okay, 1.5 hammocks. For part B, it says, which country, if either, has a comparative advantage in producing looms? Again, you look at looms, you find the lower opportunity cost, and that is held by country A. So country A would have the lower opportunity cost. And now the final question. Let me get a drink of water here. Final question, part C. It says internationally, if one loom is traded for 1.75 hammocks, who will benefit from trading? Country A only, country B only, both countries, or neither country? And so what you have to do here is you're looking just at hammocks. And so countries are going to be giving up 1 3/4 of the hammocks. What you want to do, take a look at hammocks. The opportunity cost is lower for each. So for each time, if countries are giving up 1 3/4 hammocks or being offered the opportunity to trade 1 3/4 hammocks, because their opportunity cost of producing hammocks is lower than that, both countries are going to specialize, or both countries are going to benefit from this type of trade pattern. So one way to, if you do get a question like this that's worded this way, like if it asked like 2 looms for 4 hammocks, something like that, look at this second part, what they're trading for. They're trading for hammocks. And you look at your category. If the item in question, if the opportunity cost is less than what you're being offered, you're going to benefit. Both countries are going to benefit. So if you want to reword this and say, what's the opportunity cost here? 2/3, let's say. I reworded this and said a trade was offered for you guys. 1 loom is traded for 1/3 of hammocks. You're only getting 1/3 of a hammock back. Well, because of that, your opportunity cost is too high. You're not going to choose that because now it's going to take more to make that. It's not going to fit your pattern of specialization, and you're not going to benefit from that type of trade. So in that case, because 1/3 doesn't fall ahead of these, isn't ahead of these 2 numbers, neither country would benefit. So that's how you would answer, tackle a question like that. I got 2 more. I'm going to do 1 more comparative advantage question, then I'm going to move on to Unit 2. So now there's 2 more comparative advantage questions here. You got this one, which might actually look familiar. We might have used this way back in Unit 1. And then there's this one. I'm going to do this one for the sake of time. And then if you guys want to try this one on your own, have at it. All right, so the third question in this set. This is showing output per worker per day. So again, right off the bat, you see something like this, you see a set of numbers, you see a set of countries. What should pop into your head is you're probably going to think, or you should think, this is going to be an opportunity cost comparative advantage question. I know it. Without even reading the questions, I know that's what it's going to focus around. Okay. So how would you tackle a question like this? Well, the title itself is kind of a giveaway. The output. So knowing that, what kind of question is this? This is an output question. This is showing what Newland and Beeland are capable of producing. All right, so now you got to answer these questions. And remember, either use the chart provided and then put it into some scratch paper. That's why scratch paper is going to be very important, guys, with a test like this. So they can make a cloth and they can make food. Okay, so we got Newland and we got Beeland. All right, so Newland, how much cloth can they make? They can make 10 units of cloth. Beeland. Or how much food could they make? 2. They can make 1. Okay, so Newland can make 10 units of cloth or 2 units of food. Beeland can make 10 units of cloth or 1 unit of food. Now we got to figure out comparative advantage using opportunity cost. All right, so the item in question comes a denominator. 2 divided by 10. Fifth. 10 divided by 2. 5. 1 divided by 10 is going to be 1/10. Here, 10 divided by 1. 10. Okay, so now you compare the categories. In the category just for cloth, the opportunity cost for Newland is 1/5. For Beeland, it's 1/10. So here, The opportunity cost for B land is lower, so I'm just going to bold and underline that. For Newland, the opportunity cost is 5 for producing food, 5 units of cloth. For Beeland, they would be giving up 10 units of cloth. So Newland has the comparative advantage in producing food, and Beeland has the comparative advantage in producing cloth. Again, just look at it's easy to get confused here. Follow the steps. Do the math correctly. Item in question becomes the numerator. I'm sorry, the denominator. Oh boy, I'm screwing you guys up. Item in question becomes the denominator. It's an output question. Compare each of your categories. Compare your opportunity cost for each of your categories, and then circle the lower number. You do that correctly, you follow those steps correctly, it's going to take you to the answer. All right, so the opportunity cost of producing a unit of cloth for Newland would be a fifth of a unit of food. For Beeland, the opportunity would be 10 units of cloth. Be your answer for number 2. For number 3, which nation has the comparative advantage in cloth production? Again, just look at the table you created. Okay, in cloth production, Beeland has it. So Beeland would have the comparative advantage in cloth. And then finally, Newland would have the comparative advantage in producing food. Also, keep in mind, anytime you see calculate right here, make sure you show your work, all right? Show your work on the FRQ. That's important. If you don't show your work, they won't give you credit for it. That is Unit 1. So you're welcome to check out the videos and some of the other practice problem. If you want to send me your work for it and check on it, I will go over part A and B. So part A and B, I didn't really touch on absolute advantage. Absolute advantage, you're just looking at one. You're not using comparative advantage. You're not using opportunity cost. You're just looking at one category and seeing who does it better. So if you look at part A asks, which country has absolute advantage in machines? Well, Luna can make 40 machines. Ashna can make 10 machines. Luna, because they make 40 machines. That's all you got to say. This isn't, for these explain parts, guys, this isn't saying, hey, give me 6 sentences, which is darn near impossible to try and explain in 6 sentences. You would just say in the answer for A, Luna has the absolute advantage of making machines because they can make more of them. 40 is greater than 10. Who has the absolute advantage of making food? Well, now you look at the y-axis here. Ashna can make 30 units of food. Luna can make 40 units of food. So here, this is just graphing analysis. You got to be able to read a graph, a basic X and Y graph. And the answer here would again be Luna. Why? Because they can make more food. 40 units is greater than 30. That's all the grader is looking for there. Again, something that can be answered in 1 to 2 sentences max. That's nice about AP Macro. You don't need to write a detailed essay explaining your answers. Okay. Unit 2. Unit 2 looks at economic determinants. So Nathan, if you're kind of wondering on time, we'll take like the next 15 minutes or so and then wrap it up.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right. So Unit 2. Unit 2 looks at the economic determinants of the macro economy. I'm kind of talking while I organize here. Unit 2 looks at 3 things: GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So I listed some of the basic characteristics of those 3. With GDP, you got to be able to know your components of GDP. So that's C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C for consumption, I for investments, G for government spending, X for exports, minus imports. Remember, GDP, we're only using domestic items. So the reason they take out imports is because it wasn't made here. So like if, let's say we made $1,000 worth of things here, and at the same time we bought $500 worth of things from, those are the only 2 things we did. Our GDP would be $500 because you would take the $1,000 worth of stuff you made here, subtract it from the $500 of stuff you bought from the other country. All right, so you got to know that. Remember, it's domestic. Remember, there's 2 types of GDP. There's real and nominal. We try and use real as much as we can because real is a true measure of productivity. Real takes out inflation to show what your economy is truly producing. Remember, you might have to use a price index to determine real. More on that in a second. There's 3 types of inflation. Remember, inflation is a rise in prices. That's all. It's a rise in prices. You have monetary inflation when the Federal Reserve, or our central bank, prints out too much money. You have demand pull inflation. Just visualize basic supply and demand graph, and demand shifting right. It drives up prices. Or you have cost push inflation, which is supply. Visualize supply and demand, and supply shifting to the left. More on that in a second. Then the other type or other determinant for this unit in the economy is unemployment. So make sure you know the difference between cyclical unemployment, structural unemployment, and frictional unemployment, and understand that if you see natural rate of unemployment or full employment on the exam, it's the same thing. They mean the same thing. And what they mean is it just includes structural and frictional unemployment. It does not include cyclical. Because cyclical occurs when? When there's recessions, when times are bad. Okay? All right, so here's some information to expand upon GDP. I already talked about the first bullet point. Know the differences between the 3 ways you can count GDP. You might get asked this on the test. I've seen it on some practice FRQs. There's the income approach, just adding up people's income throughout the entire economy. There's the expenditure approach, which is what the government, consumers, investments, and exports are produced and what they're paid, what they sold for. And the value-added approach. So that would be like your companies that make products that are used as an input for other goods and services. So now, to determine GDP, you don't have to add all 3 of these. These are 3 different measures that should all add up to the same number. Meaning, if you took everybody's income in the economy, that should equal the expenditure approach. It should also equal the value-added approach. Because what economists figure here is when money, they're going to take that money, they're either going to save it or they're going to spend it, right? We learned about that. People can only do 2 things. If they spend it, it's going to be shown in the expenditure approach and the value-added approach. You know, businesses spend money on their inputs. People spend money on goods and services. But what if people save it? You know, how is that counted in GDP? Well, because when people save money, where does it go? It goes into banks. And now banks take that money and they spend it on things. They give it out in loans, or they give it out to businesses to buy inputs. So that's why economists come up with this theory that all 3 of these approaches will yield the result. Okay? Know what's counted and what isn't. I kind of touched on that before. Make sure, again, it's domestic. It's domestic. So a video game made in Japan would not count to US GDP. If we made apples here in Illinois and then sold them to Canadians, it would, because the apples were made here. That would be counted as an export. All right? And then the income that Mr. Nathan earns as a tax accountant in California, that counts because that's part of the income approach. All right, so this unit is less on graphs and heavy on the equations. So the next 2 slides, I think the next 2 slides, are all your different types of equations. So I'll give you guys a second to just peruse all those. A word of advice, when you guys take this exam on Thursday, I would either print this slide or these 2 slides, or just have them out in a notebook, something so that if you get a problem that revolves around these, and you'll see that in the practice FRQs, you got it right there. And guys, that's why you guys have such a better shot, I feel, on this FRQ than in years past with other classes, because if you take this test in person, you got to memorize all these equations. Now, you can use these as notes. And a lot of times, if you have these and know how to apply them, man, you're going to be in good shape. But I'm not going to cover all of these. Keep in mind that these 2 right here, the consumer price index and the GDP deflator, Those are both types of price indexes. They just measure the rate of inflation. Now, question might come to you and you might think, well, why are there two of them then? If they both do the same thing, if they both have the same purpose to measure inflation, why two? Because we just want to confuse the hell out of you as economists. No, they serve two different purposes. The consumer price index looks at a market basket of goods and services that you guys, the consumers, tend to buy. So think about it. If you're buying stuff, think about your spending habits. You know, you buy phones, you buy water bottles, you buy all types of consumer products. Are all of these things made here in America? No, they're not. So that's why there's a difference between these two. The consumer price index can include things made here and could also include products that are made in other countries. Because a lot of the video games you play, the music you listen to, the headphones you use, a lot of that stuff is not made here, guys. So the consumer price index can include imports, while the GDP deflator only includes those four components of GDP: consumption, investment, government spending, and X minus M. That's the difference there. So I have seen that on a few practice FRQs where they'll put in there in an explanation question, tell me the difference between the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. So make sure you understand the difference between the two, okay? And how to determine them. Remember the rate of inflation. So let's say that you get a question that says something like, in 2018, the consumer price index was 110. The next year, the consumer price index was 120. Determine the rate of inflation. Well, you take the change. 120 minus 110 is 10. So your change is 10 divided by the original, which is 110, times 100 to put it into a percentage. That, guys, this is how you find a percentage change, right? The rate of inflation. Okay, so keep that one in mind. That's an important one too that you could see on the FRQ. And then these talk about how to find the labor force. Remember, your labor force is your working people plus the people who aren't working but are actively seeking work. They have to actively be seeking work. The unemployed. Remember, if you're not applying for unemployment benefits or you're not applying for jobs, you're not counted in that unemployment. You're considered a discouraged worker. I talk about that in that final bullet point there. Put that labor force into a rate, into a percentage. You divide your labor force, working plus unemployed, divide it by your population and multiply by 100. If you wanted to find the rate of unemployed in an economy, amount of people who aren't working but actively seeking, unemployed, divided by your labor force times 100. Here's some information, videos on GDP and unemployment. There's Jay Clifford, which gives you an overall review of Unit 2 if you're interested in that. All right, let's do a couple of practice FRQs. We'll wrap it up for today. And the first one is unemployment. So again, this is where scratch paper and a calculator really come in handy. And also keep in mind, remember, you got to identify important words here. Calculate. Calculate. And they kind of give it to you here. But even if they don't say show your work, guys, anytime you see calculate, you got to show your work. Okay, so this is like they're mentioning it to you twice, like reminding you, hey, to get that point, you got to show your work here. That's why I underline it. All right, so part A, you have to find the unemployment rate for country X. So you got a whole bunch of different types of unemployment here. You got frictional, structural, and cyclical. And then you have some people that aren't in labor force. And then you have some people who are in the labor force. Okay? So remember, the unemployment rate is your labor force. I'm sorry, it's your unemployed divided by your labor force. So who's unemployed here? Well, you got 10,000 people who have either had fights with their boss or are in between jobs, 10,000. People whose skills are no longer needed, 5,000. And people who are laid off because there's a recession. So 10 plus 5 plus 5 is 20,000. So 20,000 is your unemployed. That's not what the question's asking, though. It's not asking for the total unemployed. It's asking for a rate. You got to find the unemployment rate. You take 20,000. Divide by, what are you dividing by? You're dividing by your labor force. So remember, your labor force is your employed, people working, is 180,000, plus you're unemployed, 20,000. So you would take 20,000, and I'll put this into 20,000 divided by 200,000, and then you gotta multiply by 100 to put it into a rate, and you get 10%. So 10% would be your answer for part A. Part B, calculate the labor force participation rate. Again, we're not just looking for the total labor force here. We're looking for a percentage. You got to find the percentage. Now, how do you find labor force participation rate? Well, you take your labor force, which is, sorry if I'm bouncing back and forth, your labor force is 200,000. Your people who are working plus your people who are looking for work. So 200,000 divided by 300,000. What? 300,000? Where'd you get 300,000 from, Mr. Clark? Well, remember, this isn't your whole population. This is a common mistake that kids make here. They take the 200,000 and they divide it by the 100,000. That's wrong, though. The 100,000 doesn't represent your total population. Population is all this stuff. Okay? So 200,000 divided by 300,000 times the big 100 to put it into a rate, and you would get, if you round it up, 67%. Technically, it's like 66.67. Either is fine. You can round up. If you said 67%, that would be fine. Word of advice, I would be as specific as possible. So I'm not really doing you a good service here, so I change that. 66.67. Answer for B. And then for part C. Now this is where you would have to notice you don't have to draw a graph here because that's not required in the test this year, but you might have to think up a graph. And here's an example of a multiple choice question. So it says, is this economy operating to the left, right, or at long run equilibrium on an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph? And you might be wondering, all right, how do I tackle a question like this? This is the giveaway right here. Cyclical unemployment. Remember, anytime there is cyclical unemployment, that means we're in a recession. Times are bad. So that means that your economy is operating to the left. To the left shows a recessionary gap. And I pulled up recessionary gap, ADAS model. Could look like, you see it right there, but let me give you a better. There it is. Your short run equilibrium is to the left of long run. And that's all you got to do. Just say to the left. You don't have to explain it. And if you did have to explain it, you would say times are tougher, recession. There are 5,000 people who are unemployed as a result of recession, which means that short run equilibrium would be to the left. Okay? All right, we'll do one more and then we'll wrap it up.
Real quick, would there ever be a way to see from the chart that it's above full employment?
That's a good question. Because if you took,
Because they can't say negative people are employed.
no, but if
If they gave you the normal frictionally unemployed, whatever, and then give you a lesser number.
Yeah, well, if they said, if they just took away cyclical unemployment, let's make cyclical unemployment 0. You don't
They can
have
still
enough.
be at, though.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. My point is that you'll never see a question on the AP exam where they're going to give you 0 cyclical unemployment and then ask you if it's to the left, right, or at, because you don't have enough information. Your only two options would be you're either at long run equilibrium or you might be ahead. I mean, you don't know. So I guess given your basic amount of information here, no, you'll never get a question like that. If you wanted to try and use this information, again, you don't have enough to answer whether you're in an inflationary gap or a long run equilibrium. The big factor there is inflation. You know, if inflation is really increasing drastically, then you're in an expansionary or inflationary gap. Or if your GDP is higher than what your economy is capable of, like let's say the Federal Reserve sets a GDP goal of 3% for the quarter, and they look at GDP was 4.5%. then you're in an expansionary gap. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Good question. All right, last one. I hear you got a whole bunch of values related to GDP. You got everything from consumption spending on down to savings. Here's a set of questions for you. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't fit this all into one slide, guys, so I'm going to be bouncing back and forth. So if your eyes are sore by the time you're done with this, I apologize. It shows aggregate data for country X. Here's the big key. Again, these summaries, the introductory sentence or two is big because they're going to have important information there that you can use to answer some of these questions. Not all of them, but some of them. So they're not. I wouldn't just disregard the opening statement for some of these FRQs because there's important information there you can use. And for this one, it's 160. That's your price index. You're going to come back and use that. You have to. The first part, you have to calculate nominal GDP in 2019. Now, you could do this in a couple of different ways. You could do this using the income approach or the expenditures approach. There's two options here. Because if you look, let's say you wanted to use the expenditures approach. Expenditures approach is counting consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. All right, so we see government spending on here. But also we notice there's interest payments and profits and rent. And you're thinking, with a question like this, do I have to count all of these? No. Choose one of those two options in this case and stick with it. So let's do the expenditures method first. So what are we counting here with the expenditures method? Well, we're counting consumption. A little bigger there. We're counting government spending. We're counting investment spending. We're subtracting, in this case, your net exports are negative 100. So that means your people are buying more foreign goods than are being produced here. And that's it. You got them right there. There's your four components. And then you just add them up. 1,000 plus 400, we're at 1,400. Plus 300 is 1,700. And then you subtract the net exports. So your nominal GDP, in this case, would be $1,600. That's one way of doing it. And now you're wondering, all right, well, what if I used, what if I used the income approach? Hang on one second. All right. So the income approach, what we're doing is we're counting all people's income. So that would be employee compensation, interest payments, because remember, interest payments are somebody's income. It's what a banker is making when they give somebody a loan. They're being paid interest. So that's a bank's income right there, or a banker's income. It's profits. That's income. Like you sell things on eBay or Amazon, that's profit. Company. It's your rent. You know, if you're a landlord and you're in the business of renting apartments to people, your rent that you're getting is your income. Okay. So if you were to add these, 1,100 plus 125 plus 200, that would be, let's see, 1,425 plus 175, that would be $1,600. So notice that your expenditures approach, the value you get will always equal your income approach. Here they both equal 1,600. Notice that I didn't include savings here, guys. The reason I didn't include savings is because it's not counted as income here. All right? So the answer for part A, the long-winded answer, and both approaches, just pick one, would be $1,600. And then you can explain, think about what I said earlier about how income is connected to expenditures. That's how you would answer part B. If you don't remember, just go back in this video about maybe 5-10 minutes ago. Go back to the slide on GDP that I was talking about, and I'll talk about how these have some connection. Here's another one. Make sure you can explain the difference between the GDP deflator and the CPI. Remember the role of GDP. This one only includes 4 core components of GDP, while this one can include imports, things you buy from other countries. And then lastly, here's where that 160, that GDP deflator 160 comes in handy. It says using the GDP deflator, calculate the real GDP for 2019. So what you would do is you would take 1,600 divided by 160, multiplied by 100, because in this case, this is your nominal divided by your price index times 100, and I'm bad at math. So we get 1,000. There we go. So 1,000 would be your real GDP. And so what was I going to say? Real GDP shows what your economy is truly capable of producing. Remember, it takes out inflation, so it shows true productivity when you take out just price increases. There are other questions you can try out for Unit 2, like this one. Notice that it's more of a cumulative question for Unit 2. You have like a GDP question here. You got your labor force questions over here. So that's a good one if you want to try unemployment and GDP. This one revolves more around like price indexes, inflation, and GDP. Notice also there's a connection right here at the end. I'll talk about that really quick in a second. Unexpected inflation and expected inflation. That's Unit 2. All right, so Part D here. So Sarah gets a fixed rate loan from a bank where the expected inflation rate is 3%. So what that means is when the bank gave Sarah this loan, they expected inflation to be 3%. They factored that into their loan. Well, now let's say she pays the loan off and the bank goes back and they look, they messed up. They done screwed up. Inflation was really 4%. So in that case, the question asks, when there's unexpected inflation, who's winning? Sarah, the bank, neither, or both? Here's a multiple choice question, guys. You got a 25% shot. So in this case, when the inflation rate is greater than expected, Sarah is going to be the winner. Why? Well, if the bank had known that inflation was going to be 4%, they would have charged Sarah 4% when they gave her the loan, but they didn't. The bank loses in this case because when the bank gets that money back, when Sarah repays that loan, their purchasing power is less. Their money is going to buy less in real terms when they get that money back, while Sarah should have been paying 1% more over the course of the loan because of the unexpected inflation. Now, you don't have to say that entirely in your explanation here. You can either go with, from Sarah's point of view, how she benefits from inflation being 1% higher, not being charged for it, or talking about the bank losing because they should have charged Sarah a higher interest rate and therefore their money has less purchasing power when the loan is repaid. So you got to keep that in mind. When there's unexpected inflation, the lender loses, the lender's the bank, and the borrower wins. When there's unexpected deflation, when prices are lower than expected, the lender wins, the bank, person giving out the loan wins, and the borrower loses. That's another thing I keep in mind here. And hopefully that rings a bell because we talked about that in pretty good depth way back in Unit 2, and I think we touched on in Unit 3 as well. Okay? All right, so that'll do it for Unit 1 and 2 today. I will cover Unit 3 and 4 at a future Google Meet. If you want to try out these other ones that I didn't get time to talk about in terms of, and you got questions, feel free to jump on another Google Meet, send me an email, all that good stuff. That's all I got. So, Nathan, I'm going to stop recording.